Hello, and welcome to today's Deforestation Evaluating and Monitoring Challenges at the Farm Level of the Bovine Leather Supply Chain webinar. Today's presentation will be recorded and sent out to all registered participants and also will be posted on the Hub. We will have a Q&A portion throughout the presentation. You can type your questions into the question box on the webinar doc. We're excited to share this time with you today. Now on to Nicole with Textile Exchange. Nicole?
Thank you, Rose, and welcome everybody. It's great to be with you today. My name is Nicole Lambert. I'm Textile Exchange's leather manager, and I'm really pleased to welcome you all to this second webinar of our webinar series on challenges at the farm level of the bovine leather supply chain. And as Rose mentioned, we will be focusing on deforestation today. So just before we start, a bit of housekeeping. As Rose already mentioned, this event is recorded, and so we will be sharing the recording and the slides with all registered participants. We know that this time of the year is not ideal for a webinar, but the recordings will be available for everyone. You are all muted. However, we do welcome all your feedback and your questions, so please do feel free to use the Q&A function in the toolbar. I'll just read through our antitrust statement. Textile Exchange convenes the textile community and values diversity of views, expertise, opinions, backgrounds, and experiences. It is expected that members of this community will collaborate by sharing ideas, information, and resources of publicly available information only, and avoid discussions on price, strategic plans, or other private and sensitive information. So as I said, this webinar today is part of a series of webinars on the challenges at the farm level of the bovine leather supply chain. We had our first webinar in April focusing on animal welfare. And so the recording of that webinar is still available on our Hub. So if you need the link to that, please just let us know and we'll make sure we communicate it to you. We are also scheduling the third webinar of this series in September, and the third webinar will be focused on Textile Exchange's Climate Plus baseline and strategy for leather. So be on the lookout for communications about that event moving forward. So, I thought that maybe just before we launch into this webinar, it could be interesting to just make sure that we all have a common understanding of what we will be addressing today. And so starting off with, what do we refer to when we talk about forest? So when it comes to forest-related terminology, Textile Exchange aligns with the Accountability Framework Initiative, who have done an amazing job in setting definitions. And so according to the Accountability Framework Initiative, a forest is defined as land spanning more than half a hectare with trees higher than 5 meters and a canopy cover of more than 10%, or trees able to reach these thresholds in situ. It does not include land that is predominantly under agricultural or other land use, and forest includes both natural forests and tree plantations. So, what is deforestation? Again, according to AFI, the Accountability Framework Initiative, deforestation is defined as the loss of natural forests as a result of conversion to agriculture or other non-forest land use, a conversion to a tree plantation, or severe and sustained degradation. So deforestation, which is our focus today, has been an issue ever since humans began making fire, basically. For instance, research indicates that the collapse of the Mayan civilization was linked to deforestation. So deforestation has been pinned as a global problem for a long time, and it has been very clear for also a very long time that it is critical for our planet and for our future that we solve this problem. There has been multiple multilateral conventions and agreements related to forests that tackle more or less directly deforestation, starting in Rio in 1992 with the Climate Change Convention, where the forest principles were adopted. We had the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Desertification Convention in 94, the Kyoto Protocol in 97, the Paris Agreement in 2015. We have the UN Strategic Plan for Forests that was published in 2017. So that's not an agreement or a convention, but it's a very ambitious plan that was published and that has targets for 2030 relative to forests. And then finally, last year, the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forest and Land Use, where 142 parties signed a commitment to stop deforestation by 2030. So Rio was in 92, which is exactly 30 years ago. And the question is, what has happened since? Has deforestation stopped or significantly reduced? If not, why? Has the private sector taken action to address deforestation in their supply chains on a voluntary basis? Have we been doing enough? And if not, what should we be doing? So I think what's interesting as well is I remember this last week, I was listening into the New York Times Climate Forward event, which I recommend all of you to go and listen to the recording of. Our COO, Claire Bergkamp, was talking there. And anyhow, throughout the various conversations, the common message that came through was that we have now really entered an era of accountability where we must absolutely be delivering on commitments and targets if we want to limit global warming to the 2 degrees, which is our planetary boundary. So today will be an opportunity for us to see what the status on deforestation is, how it links to the farming levels of the bovine leather supply chain, so cattle production, and what is expected and what will be expected of companies using bovine leather. So we've got a great agenda for you with amazing speakers. The World Resource Institute will kick off our webinar by providing us with an overview of how forest or deforestation, has evolved over the years and where we are at today and what the impacts have been. National Wildlife Federation will pursue by giving us some insights on how cattle production links to deforestation and what has been so difficult, why it has been so difficult, to tackle the issue. Then Global Canopy will provide us with an overview of the key findings of their most recent Forest 500 report, focusing on leather especially. And finally, NWF will conclude this webinar by looking into what role legislation has to play to tackle deforestation. Do we need to move from voluntary measures to mandatory ones to reach our deforestation objectives? And how is legislation evolving on this topic and what can be expected? And hopefully we will have time for the Q&A at the end. As I said, we have an amazing panel of speakers today, and only female speakers actually. From the World Resource Institute, we have Isabella Barriga, who is the Global Forest Watch Engagement Specialist. And I know she has with her her colleague, Luis Palado, who is online with us as well and will be available for the questions at the end. From National Wildlife Federation, we have Hilary Fenrich, who's the manager of the Tropical Forest and Agricultural Department. Chloe Roscan from Global Canopy, who's a researcher there. And finally, Natalie Walker from the National Wildlife Federation, who's the Senior Director of the Tropical Forest and Agriculture Department. So without any further ado, and we've got quite an ambitious agenda for today, I will hand the floor to Isabella. So Isabella, if you can unmute yourself and take over.
Hey, thank you so much, Nicole, for the introduction. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabella Barriga. I'm Engagement Specialist with Global Forest Watch, also known as GFW. And I work across GFW to strengthen the usership and impact of GFW solutions by assessing and addressing the needs of our global community. I joined World Resources Institute about 5 months ago, and I'm excited to share with you all more about the Global Forest Watch platform, including how our data and research provides insights on the status of deforestation, including impacts and drivers. You can proceed to the next slide, please. So first, I want to provide some background. So Global Forest Watch is an initiative housed at World Resource Institute's Forest Program, also known as WRI. WRI is a global research organization that turns big ideas into action at the nexus of the environment, economic opportunity, and human well-being. WRI's programs focus on solving 7 major challenges, including food, forest, water, ocean, cities, energy, and climate. And so at GFW, we work across WRI's matrix, and we strongly collaborate with our international offices as well, which are across Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Next slide, please. So a bit more about what is Global Forest Watch. So Global Forest Watch offers an integrated, openly accessible suite of tools designed to enable experts and non-experts alike to access information about forest change and ultimately mobilize action. So some high-level examples of how this can be done include empowering forest defenders. Next slide. Increasing knowledge and transparency about forest landscapes. Next slide. Enabling responsible supply chains by advancing private sector action to stop commodity-driven deforestation to manage forests sustainably. So one of our tools, which I'll talk about later, known as GW Pro, can be used by the private sector to manage and measure risk associated with their supply chains. And next slide. Lastly, we strengthen national monitoring by harnessing information to mobilize local action. This can be done by governments and civil society. Next slide, please. Press enter just a couple more times. So I'll highlight how these 2 different programs we offer work together. Global Forest Watch. So this is a free tool that can be used to analyze geospatial data on a map. You can download this data and analyze your area of interest. On the other hand, we will also have Global Forest Review. And this is an online living report which provides the latest information on the state of the world's forests. So we see Global Forest Watch and Global Forest Review as complementary resources. Next slide. And so I'll explain the data and explain how we provide at GFW an analysis of annual tree cover loss data each year. And this is actually coming from University of Maryland. And we run an analysis to show when and where forest loss has occurred around the world. We actually released the latest 2021 tree cover loss data last spring, and I'll dive deeper into the results momentarily. And I wanted to note that with tree cover loss data, we're not differentiating between types of loss, but these contextual data sets and satellite imagery can help us draw more informed conclusions about the nature and the drivers of forest change events. Next slide. So over here, I'll explain that tree cover loss includes forest loss as well as loss of industrial tree plantations and agricultural tree crops. So the statistics reported in this indicator capture gross tree cover loss, which is the total loss, irrespective of any tree cover gain that may have occurred during that same year. And the data shows that the annual rates of global tree cover loss have risen since 2001. As you can see in this graphic, it shows the tree cover loss by millions of hectares across ecozones. This includes boreal, temperate, tropical, and subtropical from 2001 to 2021. So as you can see, the majority of this loss is coming from tropical forests, which is in the dark green, and the tropics lost 11.1 million hectares of tree cover in 2021, which is equivalent to the size of Bulgaria. And this is a 9% decrease in rates of forest loss in 2020, but this is still far too high. Overall, the world has lost 437 million hectares of tree cover loss since the turn of the century. And tree cover loss, as you can see, has been rising in recent history from 13.4 million hectares tree cover loss in 2001 to 25.3 million hectares in 2021. And I also wanted to note that at Global Forest Watch, we're defining tree cover loss as the complete removal of tree cover for any reason, whereas deforestation, on the other hand, and as Nicole mentioned earlier, typically refers to human-caused permanent removal of natural forest cover. So this shows, and we use this because tree cover loss data can be measured more consistently at a global scale. Next slide, please. And GFW, we primarily focus on loss in the tropics because this is where more than 96% of deforestation occurs. Of particular concern, there are 3.75 million hectares of loss in 2021 that occurred within tropical primary rainforests, which is equivalent to a rate of 10 football pitches a minute. And tropical primary forest loss in 2021 resulted in 2.5 gigatons of carbon dioxide emissions. And though the tropics lost 11% less primary forest in 2021 than in 2020, that is still followed by a 12% increase from 2019 to 2020, which is actually mostly due to an increase also in fire-related loss. And overall, we've seen with our data that humid tropic forests have lost 68.4 million hectares of primary forests since the turn of the century. Next slide, please. And here we can also use this data to drill down into some of the world's most important forests. So here's a deeper look at some of the trends in forest loss in 2021. As the country with the most primary rainforests to begin with, Brazil consistently tops the list for most primary forest loss. Over 40% of tropical primary forest loss in 2021 occurred in Brazil, which is a total of 1.5 million hectares. Loss related to fires has fluctuated here. Meanwhile, non-fire losses, which in Brazil are most associated with agriculture expansion, increased 9% from 2020 to 2021. And the Western Brazilian Amazon has several areas of new primary forest loss hotspots, meaning that these are places that experience a statistically significant appearance of new loss in 2021. Many of the new hotspots encompass large-scale clearings, like for cattle pastures along existing roads. And I'll also note Bolivia, on the other hand, also experienced a record high primary forest loss due to fires and large-scale agriculture. In particular, the past 3 years have seen consistently high rates of loss in Bolivia, with fires accounting for over a third of the loss each year. Fires in Bolivia are usually set by humans, and this are usually part of efforts to clear land. And the majority of forest fires in 2021 burned in the department of Santa Cruz in Bolivia, which is the country's epicenter of large-scale agriculture like soy and cattle ranching. And I'll also note agriculture, energy demands, and logging drove primary forest loss in the Congo Basin. DRC lost nearly 500,000 hectares of primary forest in 2021 due to the expansion of small-scale agriculture and harvesting trees to meet energy demands. Next slide, please. And here I'll talk about forestry, commodity-driven deforestation, and how this combined with wildfire and shifting agriculture are the leading causes of tree cover loss. So I'll explain which these mean. So forestry, this includes large-scale forestry operations occurring with managed forests and tree plantations, and this is associated with 135 million hectares of tree cover loss. And commodity-driven deforestation, this includes permanent conversion of forests for commodity production, including agriculture, mining, or oil and gas production. And this is associated with 117 million hectares of tree cover loss from 2001 to 2021. And then I'll also note shifting agriculture, which is associated with 88 million hectares of tree cover loss. And this includes agriculture practices where forests are cleared and used for agriculture production for a few years and then temporarily abandoned to allow trees to regrow. So shifting agriculture involves many different types of smallholder farming practices. The next slide. And so to expand on this, from looking at driver loss by region, we can see that tropical regions experience more tree cover loss related to agriculture, whereas boreal and temperate regions experience more loss from forestry and wildfire. So I'll note the bottom, you can see that commodity-driven deforestation, which is in orange, accounted for 62% of tree cover loss in Latin America. Next slide, please. And here we can also dive deeper into how much of this deforestation data is linked to agriculture. And I want to know that critically, the next slide. Critically does not necessarily imply that current day farms or pastures were directly responsible for past deforestation events. This approach does not allow monitoring of the potential indirect effects of these commodities on deforestation. I just want to note the limitations here. For example, where expansion of a commodity displaces other forms of farming, and this can contribute to deforestation elsewhere. And so results are shown at the second administrative level, and that can be at the country, municipality, or other administrative subdivision, depending on the country. And I wanted to flag that this data, which you can find in Global Forest Review, is also part of a peer-reviewed publication, which I have a screenshot to the left. The methods are available in this technical note, and I'm happy to share the link to that as well, if anyone is interested. And it's explain the role of the 7 commodities in agricultural linked deforestation, looking at oil, palm oil, soy, cattle, wood, fiber, cocoa, coffee, and rubber. And I'll talk more about these in the next slide. So this graph illustrates those analyzed commodities: cattle, palm oil, soy, cocoa, rubber, coffee, wood, and fiber, which explain 57% of tree cover loss from agriculture from 2001 to 2015. And as we can see here, cattle replace the most forest by far. Cattle pasture now occupies some 45.1 million hectares of land deforested from 2001 to 2015, accounting for 36% of all tree cover loss associated with agriculture. And during that time period, oil, palm ranked second, followed by soy, then cocoa, plantation, rubber, coffee, and plantation wood fiber around the same. So you can see that cattle actually replace nearly twice as much forest as all the other commodities combined. Next slide, please. And so, yes, this graph shows forest areas replaced by cattle worldwide. This includes Brazil, Paraguay, Colombia, Bolivia, Argentina, and others. And forest area replaced by cattle accounts for 36% of all agricultural linked tree cover loss worldwide. And just note that we're looking at where pasture has replaced forest. We can't actually say how much is being produced in those pasture areas. Next slide. I'll talk a bit about the hotspots of forest replacement, and this varies by commodity, but as we can see in this graph, this is mostly concentrated in the tropics. Most of this deforestation occurred in Brazil, around 21.8 million hectares, or close to 48%, followed by Paraguay, 9%, and Colombia, which is closer to 5%. And in particular, in Brazil, the states of Pará and Mato Grosso in Brazil experienced the greatest area of forest replacement by cattle, with around 5 million hectares each between 2001 and 2015. Slide, please. So as we can see, forest replacement by cattle is most prevalent in Brazil and Paraguay. In Brazil, for the year of 2018, just over half of the country's total tree cover loss area between 2001 and 2015, 42.21 million hectares, was deforestation for pasture. And so we can see this is the overall trend, and since the data is from 2001 to 2015. Next slide. And diving deeper into this, 70% of this deforestation occurred actually in the Brazilian Amazon, and another 20% occurred in Cerrado. In the Amazon in particular, deforestation is linked to pasture peaked in 2005 and then dropped around half that level thereafter. Deforestation, however, in Cerrado peaked in 2004, as you can see in this graph, and then followed by a much less dramatic decline than in the Amazon. And to know that this timing of decline corresponds to interventions and changes in public policy to reduce deforestation. As I mentioned earlier, this trend largely follows the total Brazil tree cover loss trend, since this analysis stopped at 2015. It doesn't capture this graph, the uptick in the loss that occurred post 2015. Next slide. And I'll also touch a bit on the climate impacts tree cover loss. Globally, carbon dioxide removals by existing and regenerating forests exceed greenhouse gas emissions from forest disturbances such as deforestation, wood harvest, and wildfires. And to note, between 2001 and 2021, emissions from deforestation and other forest disturbances were 8.4 gigatons of CO2 per year on average, while removals from forests were negative 15.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year on average. So this results in an average net sink of negative 7.2 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. And actually the countries with the highest forest-related emissions have extensive forest area. For Brazil, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Bolivia, the majority of forest-related greenhouse gas emissions were associated with the clearing of forests for commodity production, reflecting a permanent loss of tree cover. Meanwhile, the majority of forest-related emissions in the United States, Canada, and China were associated with forestry operations within these countries, likely reflecting temporary losses, tree cover loss due to harvesting cycles. On the next slide. So for example, here you can see how commodity-driven deforestation was the driver of the highest forest emissions in Brazil and Indonesia. We can see at the top. Specifically, this results in 1.15 gigatons of CO2 in Brazil, which makes up over 70% of forest emissions in Brazil. However, in Indonesia, the release was 0.89 gigatons of carbon from commodity-driven deforestation. This made up over 90%, 95% actually of those forest emissions. Go on the next slide. I also want to note just the crucial role that forests play in the global fight against climate change, as they can remove and store carbon from the atmosphere. Our data shows that forests absorb twice as much carbon as they emit each year. The world's forests emit an average of 8.1 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year due to deforestation and other disturbances, but they absorb 16 billion metric tons of CO2 per year. And the world's 3 largest tropical forests located in the Amazon, Congo River Basin, and Southeast Asia are some of the most important ecosystems for mitigating climate change. Their ability to store carbon makes them a carbon sink. And tropical forests collectively sequester more carbon from the atmosphere than temperate or boreal forests, but they're also being increasingly destroyed for agricultural expansion. Next slide.
Yeah, and Isabella, if I can ask you to start wrapping up in
Sure.
the next minutes, thanks.
Absolutely. So here I just want to quickly note what the Global Forest Watch map looks like on the next slide. We put this data into context to show how much forest change has occurred. You can see the tree cover loss data that I talked about earlier, in addition to land cover, land use data. You can also use the map to see conservation protected areas. Again, this is all a free, openly accessible tool. If you want to go to the next slide. So just to wrap up, these are the tools that we offer on Global Forest Watch. The one that would be of most interest that I like to call out is Global Forest Watch Pro, which allows you to securely manage deforestation risks in commodity supply chains. Go to the next slide. So this is typically used by businesses to securely monitor forests across a portfolio of locations. And this can be used to monitor thousands of properties, producers, free of charge, with data including deforestation alerts. Next slide. Just want to show an example of what this looks like. If you have DFW Pro, you have a dashboard where you can manage all of your supplier areas in one place. You can set up alerts to see where deforestation or fire alerts may be occurring in your area of interest. Going to the next slide. I've also included my colleague Luis Calado's information. He's an engagement specialist for Global Forest Watch Pro. So if you're interested in using the tool, want to learn more about it, I have his email listed here. And that's all that I have. Thank you again for your time. I hope this information was helpful, and I've also included my contact information in case you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Isabella, and sorry for rushing you at the end there, but that was just really interesting and definitely a reality check or slap, I don't know. Yeah, thank you to you and your team also for all the great work you do at Global Forest Watch to actually gather all that data and information that we so critically need. Thank you. And so I will hand it over to Hilary from NWF, who will provide us with more context around the links between deforestation and cattle production. So Hilary unfortunately was not able to join us today, and so she provided us with a great recording that I'll be playing now. So here we go.
Hello and good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. For those of you that don't know me yet, my name is Hilary Fenrich. I work at the National Wildlife Federation. I'm the manager of the international team, and I support all of our work in Brazil, and I lead our strategy in Paraguay. I also sit on the board of directors for the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and I co-moderate the Nature Positive Working Group. And today I'm here just to talk a little bit about the connection between cattle and deforestation. Want to say a big thank you to Anne, Nicole, and Marissa for the invitation to talk here today. My apologies that I couldn't be here live. NWF actually has a summer break this week. And I also just want to say happy 4th of July to any folks joining from the United States. So we do have a number of things to get through. So I want to just go ahead and share my screen. I know that our colleagues from WRI just set the context for deforestation globally. And today I really want to help make that link between deforestation and cattle and walk you through a few key points. So we know that in the world, about 80% of deforestation is directly linked to agricultural production. And when we're thinking about what commodities are really responsible for this, we have about 7 key commodities. Big thanks again to our colleagues at WRI who put this study together. What we see is cattle by far is considered the most high risk commodity in terms of deforestation. We also see after that palm oil, soy, cacao, rubber, and coffee are right here above wood products in terms of environmental risk. And we also see that these commodities don't only just have environmental risk, but there's also social risk associated with these commodities, such as slave labor, child labor, lack of respect for indigenous territories, etc. And during my presentation today, you're going to hear that I'm going to bring up a few examples regarding Brazil. And I want to just be really clear why. So thanks again to WRI for this most recent study. But when we look at 2021, we know that about 40% or more than 40% of global tropical primary forest loss last year in 2021 occurred in Brazil. So that's 1.5 million hectares. So if I'm bringing up Brazil examples, this is the reason why. Just to really set out that context. We also know when we're looking at deforestation, why is deforestation so closely associated with cattle? We know that land is seen as more valuable if cleared. So we see, for instance, that in the Paraguay and Chaco, actually the land prices, if your land has no native vegetation on it, it is considered a more valuable piece of land. It costs more than land that has the native Paraguay and Chaco in it, for instance. And when we're digging into like why that happens, we can see that if you were going to clear some land, you would need permits, which take time, potentially money. You would need a tractor, so you need to rent that tractor or buy that tractor. You need labor to actually cut down that forest. And you need fencing, and fencing is more expensive than we think it is. So there's a higher value placed on that piece of cleared land. But what that value is really missing is the value of ecosystem services. So ecosystem services being anything like provisioning services, so food, water, medicine. A good chunk of our medicine in Western culture actually comes from tropical forests. It means pollination, ecosystem services include biodiversity, connectivity, cultural services, recreation. So we can all take like a nice little walk in the Brazilian Amazon, nutrient cycling. And then beyond all of that, of course, what we're all talking about, carbon storage and climate regulation. I want to be really clear that although there are claims that deforestation is driven by land speculation and cattle is really just used to keep land occupied, what we see is land is really linked to the industry that's happening around it. So land values would drop if there were no meat packers or soy silos nearby. It is therefore impossible to divorce land from land use as a driver of deforestation. In Brazil, we can see here on this chart that deforestation rates are at 15-year high. This is from INPE, so the Brazilian National Institute of Space Research, and they are the foremost source, official source for deforestation data. We can see that 2021, so last year, if we look all the way back 15 years, which would be 2007, 2001 has the highest rate. The only highest rate is 16 years ago in 2006. We also know that this has made it so that the Brazilian Amazon is a net carbon source for the very first time. Let's just let that sink in for a minute. The Brazilian Amazon is now a net carbon source, which means that it's emitting more than it's capturing carbon, which of course is alarming, to put it very lightly. I just want to be clear that the lead author of this study actually works at INPE, and she collected data for almost a decade in terms of seasonal and regional climatic differences. So what she has really seen is now is a net carbon source because of deforestation and because of fires. We know that the Amazon is losing its ability to be resilient. And in addition, we know that about 70% of deforested land in the Amazon is already converted into pasture. So it's really important just to make that link clear and clear. So why is cattle the largest driver of deforestation? Historically, we know that cattle were the cheapest and the easiest way to really demonstrate land ownership, in particular in frontier regions. So when we look at Brazil, for instance, we know that the expansion was actually incentivized by the Brazilian government. So there was a military dictatorship from 1964 to 1985 in Brazil. And after that, there was a lot of social unrest. There was this real desire for secure borders, and there was a desire for modernization. The Amazon at that time was the least populated region, and the government provided incentives for folks to go to the Amazon and to clear land in order to really secure land tenure. And this, therefore, would help provide additional security around borders. We also know that culturally, throughout South America, cattle ranching is largely extensive. So that means the vast majority is not feedlot cattle. When cattle are allowed to graze the same pasture for more than 2 days, they destroy the root of the grasses. This leads to pasture degradation. Pasture degradation, therefore, makes it seem like you need to clear more land as an easier way than really helping replenish and rejuvenate that land. We also know that implementation of sustainable practices can be a challenge. So there's the cost in fencing, there's a cost in terms of quality pasture and cattle breeds, and then there's also costs beyond fencing and kind of things, and more about services, so capacity building, for instance. When we talk about cattle and deforestation, it's really key to also talk about productivity. Ranchers love to talk about productivity, and so do we. So when we're thinking about deforestation, we're thinking about when you deforest forests, you essentially release stored carbon. And this stored carbon accelerates regional and global climate change. And it also reduces agricultural productivity because of this climate change. And therefore, we then see economic losses. So I wanted to bring in just like an economic piece, which is in 2008, Edward Eduardo Assad in Brazil published a study on what would a model look like in 2020 in terms of losses, economic losses from reduced agricultural productivity due to these regional climate change impacts. And what he estimated was 7 billion reais were going to be lost due to decreased productivity, particularly in the Brazilian corn and soy industry. 2020 rolled around, and instead of 7 billion reais, which is about $1.3 billion, he saw $7 billion US dollars were lost in 2020 due to this decreased productivity. So there is this economic link. And of course, as we talked about before, there's not just the economic link, there's the ecosystem services, which are being lost and not being valued the way that they should be. We know that there's through better pasture management, such as rotational grazing, quality grasses, this allows more cattle per hectare and sustained pasture quality. So there's no need to clear land to expand because you don't have degraded pastures in the first place. We know in Brazil, 40% of pasture is monetarily or severely degraded, which is about 60 million hectares, which is alarming. But we also know that in other places such as Colombia, Colombia is really well known for their silvopasture systems. So that's a combination of livestock and trees. When we dig into why, that's likely due to geopolitical and terrain reasons. Ranches are smaller and they also have hillier terrain. So they need to have those trees in order to prevent erosion and degradation. And when we talk about challenges and how we can address these challenges, collectively, we need to support robust implementation of public time-bound deforestation commitments. We want to see that these commitments have increasing ambition. We want to see that they have engagement with suppliers, so tannery suppliers as meat packers suppliers like direct and indirect suppliers. We want to see monitoring and traceability. Where is that cattle coming from? What sort of conditions were on those lands? We want to see verification and the publishing of results and progress. We need collective support for improved forest and supply chain governance, and we know that this works. The reason why we know this works is right here in this publication by Dr. Holly Gibbs at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and she really looked at what happened in the Brazilian Amazon after the TAC agreements and after the G4 agreements in 2009. That's a whole speech in itself, so that's probably a little bit for later, but what we essentially saw was that a mixture of government and voluntary supply chain agreements did reduce deforestation. It avoided deforestation among direct suppliers in the Brazilian Amazon. A current major challenge that we're seeing is indirect suppliers. So not the suppliers that are directly selling to the meat packer, but the suppliers 1 step or 2 steps or 3 steps before that, who are selling directly to another supplier. We know that in Brazil, most deforestation occurs on farms of indirect suppliers, and their monitoring and traceability is not the norm, although they're currently in the scope of the supply chain agreements I mentioned. Unfortunately, those aren't the only challenges. We also see that most beef is consumed domestically, and the major export markets for the beef and leather, that 20%, have not, unfortunately, historically demonstrated sufficient concern for deforestation. This, of course, is changing. We see this with the pending international regulations. We also see that there's varying levels of regional data availability and transparency. So things look a little bit different in this state or that state, and this makes monitoring and traceability of suppliers more difficult. But it is an essential key ingredient to every single one of the pending international regulations that Natalie Walker will talk about at the end of this webinar. And there's nowhere where this monitoring and traceability, data availability, and transparency can't be improved. We see that there's globally weak forest governance and enforcement. It's not historically well funded. There's been bills that are published that actually hurts forest governance. And we also see very few fines and consequences for poor environmental performance. So in 2019 and 2020, the Brazilian Institute of Environment and Renewable Natural Resources actually only issued a notice or a fee on 1.3% of deforestation alerts, despite the vast majority of deforestation being illegal in Brazil. And Brazil is not alone in this, unfortunately. In Paraguay, for instance, in 2020, there were 76,000 controls of environmental restrictions. There was 76,000, environmental issues. And of these, 66 were fined. We also see the challenge of upfront costs and technical support, such as the fencing that I was talking about. And it's also really key to note that deforestation has its social links. They are not independent of one another. We see this with slave and child labor. We see this with expansion into indigenous territories. There are a number of indigenous territories that are still waiting for demarcation. What that means is in the Paraguayan Chaco, for instance, if a rancher wanted to expand his or her property, it actually wouldn't know if it was overlaid on top of an indigenous territory, because there's 265 indigenous territories that have not been demarcated and are not in the digital database. So it's really difficult to currently evaluate holistically what's happening in terms of indigenous territories. I know that there's some fantastic NGOs, including our local partner Sandata, who are working on this. So that was a little intense, those slides, but I want to just leave us with a little bit of hope. So there is hope. We see that there's these pending international regulations that really will move the needle on acting on deforestation conversion. And in particular, as I said, monitoring and traceability is baked into each one of those regulations, which Natalie will talk a little bit more about. So we see that there's hope in terms of the international landscape changing. We see financing is on the table. We especially saw this after COP. We see that there are more and more public-private partnerships and platforms that are creatively finding these collaborations to tackle these issues, and we need that collaboration. So we recently in April signed an agreement with the Ministry of Agriculture and Livestock in Paraguay to support an innovative market tool. This will help Paraguay not only be able to face these pending international legislations, but it also helps support more sustainable practices, which is a win-win. We also see the Global Roundtable for Sustainable Beef has 3 decade-long goals, so animal welfare, carbon emissions, and nature positive. And if you're interested in finding more, learning more about this, please contact me. As I said, I co-moderate the Nature Positive group. We also see that there's some countries such as Brazil and Paraguay that do have forest codes that protect forest and native vegetation on private lands, despite being considered some of the highest risk countries. So they exist on paper. Now we need to help support with implementation. We also see that there's key biomes that are getting additional international limelight, such as the Brazilian Cerrado, a woody savanna that very few folks knew anything about 5 years ago, and the Gran Chaco, which spans 4 countries, but is really key in Paraguay and Argentina. And more than anything, there's more guidance than ever to support a low carbon transition. So if you need guidance, if you need to know what sort of protocol should I have, what sort of purchasing policy, how do I know what I should really be doing, please reach out. There's tons of NGOs working on this, including NWF, and we are more than happy to help. And if I wanted to leave you all with one little piece, if you only got one thing from this recording, it's that I want to be really clear that at any point of the value chain, we can all support sustainable leather and beef while supporting the protection of forests and native vegetation. And we can do this through increasing public commitments. We can do this through dedicated engagement with our suppliers, robust monitoring and traceability, and then also verifying and publishing results and increasing progress. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. And thank you all so much for the time and the attention. And I'm here with anything that you need. Thank you so much. Take care now.
Thank you, Hilary. As I told you, that was a recording. And if you do have any questions for her, please just put them in the Q&A box and she'll answer them offline. Make sure those are communicated back to you afterwards. But this definitely helps us better understand the challenges we're facing in the farming levels of the bovine leather supply chain. And it's great to see that, there are some efforts that are being made. And so I guess the next step is just to make sure that we pursue and scale up the efforts in this space. And so on that note, that brings me to Global Canopy and the Forest 500 report. So I'd like to welcome Chloe from Global Canopy. Global Canopy carries out a yearly survey where they basically compile public commitments addressing deforestation of free supply chains for 6 high-risk commodities, including leather, and then they assess them and they rank them. And so Chloe will give us some insight on how what the landscape looks like, what are the key conclusions when it comes to companies also using leather, and the commitments they are making in that space that are publicly available. So Chloe, I'll let you unmute yourself.
Thanks so much. So thanks for that lovely introduction, Nicole. And also thank you to Hilary and Isabella for sort of setting the stage of the situation on the ground at the forest and also at the cattle farm level. Hi everyone, thanks for joining us. My name's Chloe, I work at Global Canopy and I specifically work on a project called Forest 500, which, as Nicole described, assesses companies and financial institutions in this space. So today I'll be taking you through a high-level look at how Forest 500 assessments work and some key stats relating to leather and the fashion industry in particular's performance from the 2021 assessments, the report of which was published in January this past year. So as both Hilary and Isabella touched on before, despite new proposals for supply chain legislation in the UK and the European Union, and new commitments made in the private sector to tackle deforestation in their supply chains and financial portfolios, deforestation in Brazil is at its highest level in 15 years. In May alone, the deforested area of the Amazon rainforest was the same size as the city of London. The Forest 500 was started to bring accountability to the companies and financial institutions with the greatest influence on tropical deforestation and how to track how they're doing some of the global commitments, some of the global commitments mentioned previously, some of them Nicole brought up in the opening, that were made on tackling deforestation linked to commodity production. For 8 years now, Forest 500 has been assessing companies and financial institutions on the strength and implementation of their policies on deforestation and the associated human rights. I was going to the next slide, please, but Nicole, you've beaten me to it, so that's fine. Every 2 years, the Forest 500 identifies the companies and financial institutions with the most exposure to tropical deforestation through the production, sourcing, or financing of the 6 highest forest risk commodities, which are beef and leather, soy, palm oil, timber, and pulp and paper. We identify the countries with the greatest tropical forest loss. In our latest selection process in 2022, the countries identified covered 96% of tropical deforestation. We look at multiple data sets to do this in this process, like the examples Isabella took us through earlier today. We then identify the countries which are importing and exporting the highest value of each of the forest risk commodities in their different forms. We then use this to select companies at each stage of the supply chain for these commodities. That's from producers through to traders through to brands. We use different data and metrics depending on which commodity and segment of the supply chain the data is available for. But this includes metrics like land bank area owned, market share of the relevant markets, or volume of the commodity handled. In 2021, a total of 59 companies were assessed on their exposure to leather. 21 of those were operating in the textile industry at the brand level. Once we've identified those 350 companies, we then identify the 150 financial institutions that provide the most finance to those companies, and that's through shareholdings, loans and underwritings, and bonds. So the Forest 500 is really focusing on the big players, those which have the most ability to drive the change throughout the forest risk commodity supply chains. Next slide, please. We have 2 different methodologies that we use, one specifically for companies, which is aligned with the Accountability Framework Initiative's common methodology, and one for the financial institutions, with both being aligned with best practice for the sector. As you can see on this slide, the Forest 500 methodology focuses on 4 key areas. The first is the overall approach, which looks at the high-level action the company is taking to address deforestation. Second is the policy or commitment strength, which looks at the strength and scope of those commitments on deforestation and traceability as well. The third is the social considerations, which Hilary mentioned before, which assesses on whether the company has policies in place to address critical human rights issues in those forest risk supply chains, which include labour rights, land use rights, the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples, often referred to as FPIC, And finally, the reporting and implementation of those commitments. While we can't see what's happening on the ground, we look at how companies are communicating publicly about the implementation of their commitments and whether they're following best practices to ensure they're effectively implemented. For our 2021 assessments, we increased the weighting of our reporting and implementation sections for both companies and financial institutions, which saw scores across many companies fall slightly in 2021 because of this. Next slide, please. So the beef and leather supply chain. So again, as mentioned before, the cattle industry is the cattle industry is currently the greatest direct driver of deforestation in Latin America. Again, recent estimates are that over 1 million hectares of deforestation in the Amazon and Cerrado can be attributed to pasture deforestation each year. It's often claimed that the animals are raised and slaughtered only or mainly for meat, and that the hide is a byproduct that would otherwise go to waste. Cattle are raised for profit from whichever part of the animal that profit can be generated from. This includes the hide, of course, and leather. There are a lot of small producers at the farm and ranch level for beef and leather, meaning the same quality of data isn't the same or even available as for the other commodities that we assess. Bigger companies dominate the slaughterhouse and trader level, so there aren't any leather producers in the Forest 500, but we do assess companies at every other stage. I'm now going to take you through some high-level stats from the 2021 assessments, focusing on leather and the fashion companies who are assessed. Next slide, please. Thank you. So within our overall approach section of our methodology, we assess a company on their overarching deforestation commitments, those that apply to that entire company and all of the raw materials involved in their supply chains. So you can see here that compared to the other commodities we assess on their overall approach, beef and leather both score much lower across the board than the others. You can see on this slide that 72% of companies assessed for palm oil have an overarching deforestation commitment that specifically includes palm oil, compared to just 30% for beef and 28% for leather companies. As previously mentioned, 21 of the 59 companies assessed for leather are in the textile or fashion industry at the retail level. The others that we assess are involved in footwear, furniture, and the automotive sectors, as well as those further down the supply chain. You can see that just over half of those 21 fashion companies have a commitment which includes leather specifically. We then score each company on the strength of those commitments, from sustainability through to zero deforestation and zero conversion, conversion being the strongest scoring. We classify conversion as the change of a natural ecosystem to another land use or profound change in the natural ecosystem's species composition, structure, or function. Next slide, please. So the next slide talks about traceability and scope. So companies in leather supply chains score particularly poorly on traceability compared to the other Forest 500 commodities for reasons mentioned previously by our previous two speakers, especially on tracing down to the point of production to the farm or ranch level. The Forest 500 looks at how far down the supply chain fashion companies commit to applying their deforestation commitments, and also how far down they're actually trying to trace down to with or without some level of assurance. You can see that over 60% of fashion companies do not have a traceability commitment currently at all for leather, with a very small number committing to trace back to the farm level. For both deforestation and traceability, we also look at the scope of these commitments, whether they apply to all of the raw material sourcing regions or just one location or product line. 33% of the fashion companies who made a deforestation commitment for leather committed to applying this to all of their leather sourcing, and 19% chose to focus on leather originating from the Amazon biome specifically, which touches on the point that Hilary made earlier about certain biomes being highlighted at the moment. Next slide, please. So again, deforestation doesn't happen in isolation. Deforestation is often preceded by human rights abuses, including land use conflict, or comes into conjunction with them. Forest 500 assesses companies on 6 key human rights indicators. That's labour rights, gender, smallholder inclusion, the free prior informed consent, remediation, and land use rights. On this slide, you can see the statistics comparing all 59 companies assessed for leather against the 21 fashion companies. The labour rights indicator, which looks at companies' policies on the 4 key labour standards, which are forced and child labour, discrimination, and the right to freedom of association. And if that policy applies to the whole of the supply chain, from tier 1 suppliers all the way down to the raw material level. Almost all fashion companies have some level of labour rights policy that covers their supply chain, compared to just over 50% for leather companies in general. FPIC performs a lot worse for both and is something that clearly needs addressing when companies are looking at their human rights abuse risks overall. The disparity between being able to trace down to the farm level shown in the previous slide in leather supply chains and being able to implement these human rights commitments is clearly an issue. Deforestation and human rights abuses are interlinked and need to be tackled together in company action on deforestation. We need to see all companies have strong and comprehensive policies in place for all human rights abuses, not just for some. Next slide, please. As I mentioned earlier, we can't see what's happening on the ground, but we can see how companies are communicating about the processes they follow to implement their commitments. So looking at things like, are they reporting progress? Are they disclosing sourcing regions or supplier lists? And are they monitoring their supply chains for compliance? On this slide, you can see that the total 59 leather companies assessed, less than 10% disclose the number of hides or tons of leather within their supply chains, with a higher number reporting their supplier lists at some level. Fashion companies who did disclose the supplier lists have done so at the tannery level through to their tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers. Whilst this provides some transparency, it means that they are not drilling down to where the deforestation is actually happening. Next slide, please. The Forest 500 shows that not enough is being done in leather supply chains to address the deforestation, conversion, and the associated human rights abuses. Leather needs attention because it's a valuable product of the cattle ranching and slaughter, and therefore, like with valuable edible cattle products, there's the responsibility to address this deforestation risk, and great potential also for helping drive positive transformation alongside these efforts in edible product supply chains. Our data shows that there are large gaps in the efforts by companies to address these risks, but positively, by bringing brands together through channels such as this, we can increase the transparency and close those gaps. Next slide, please. We need to see companies and financial institutions address their exposure to deforestation and associated human rights abuses now. We need to see the laggards that still haven't set a single deforestation policy, set strong and comprehensive policies which cover all of their operations and raw material sourcing. And we need to see everyone shift their focus to effective implementation on the ground. Our full assessments are published online, including the score, quote collected to score the company, and a link to the data source. This means that not only can companies see where they can improve, but also see what their peers are doing and identify areas for collaboration and sharing of data across the sector. Next year, we need to have to see more progress from the 350 companies, including the ones who are assessed for leather, as they are the ones who can make the most difference and have the potential to transform the entire industry, but they really need to step up now to make that a reality. Our Forest 500 data is completely free, and documents explaining our selection process, methodology, and our annual reports are all currently available on our website if you'd like to know more about it, or you can contact me via the email address shown on the screen after this slide. Thank you so much, and if you have any questions, please ask away in the Q&A section at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chloe. That was really interesting, and I think, as you said, yeah, maybe there is a need to step up, the commitments and the robustness of these commitments, and maybe there's a need for more guidance for brands. To achieve that, as well as maybe a roadmap or a support system to help them achieve those objectives. But thank you so much. That was fantastic. We're coming to the end of our webinar, and our last speaker is Natalie Walker from the National Wildlife Federation. She'll be digging into the question of legislation around deforestation. How is the legislation evolving? Is it maybe time for us to shift, from voluntary measures into legally binding ones to achieve our objectives? So I will hand it over to Natalie.
Hello, I'm Natalie Walker from the National Wildlife Federation. I'm going to be giving a brief overview of 3 sets of proposed regulations aiming to reduce deforestation in major commodity supply chains. I'm just going to be setting out what they are, some of the similarities and differences, and then finally what companies can do to help prepare for these. So in all cases, there was a recognition that deforestation risk is still present in major commodities, in key import markets in Europe and the US, and that the voluntary approach had not been leading to significant changes on the ground. And so therefore, over the past several years, there's been processes to develop regulation. So specifically in the European Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And they all include a requirement to avoid illegal deforestation in the commodities that will be in scope, which I'll go through. Although the EU regulation also includes a zero deforestation component. As I mentioned, all these regulations are still proposals. In all cases, they are likely to change before they become finalized. And so in regards to the zero deforestation component in the EU, it was proposed initially to be December 2020. Now there was a newer proposal for December 2021. So we still have to see where that date is going to land. So first, to go through the regulation in the US, it's called the Forest Act. It includes a risk-based framework, and the goal is to limit imports that are linked to illegal deforestation from the date that the act becomes a law. So it will be at some point in the future. And there will be a set of commodities in scope. And in addition to having a regulation to ensure that there is no illegal deforestation embedded in products, there's also aiming to be financial and technical assistance to producer countries in order for them to ensure that they can produce sufficient quantities of compliant material, and other potential benefits such as a preference for products that are deforestation free. In the European Union, the EU Commission released a proposal last November, which includes, as I've mentioned, a zero deforestation component and another component that requires compliance with producer country laws. And they ask for a geolocation of the sourcing area, though it doesn't have to be farm to fork traceability. It appears this is still being worked out, but that goods arriving can have a suite of their sourcing areas. And there needs to be negligible risk of illegal deforestation, and then also deforestation free from whatever the cutoff date is going to be. Though in the EU, there are 3 different bodies. The 2 others sort of released their comments on the original proposal, and there's a process called Trilog, which is due to take place probably sometime this fall, that will discuss and then come up with a final law. And the aim is to have that agreement through the process by the end of the year, but it may not be until next year. In the EU, similarly last November, the UK Environment Act came into law, which noted that there will be a requirement for products in scope to not come from illegal deforestation. But it did note that there was a need for secondary legislation to get through to the details of what that means, how it will be, what the scope of companies covered will be. It's probably not going to be the smallest companies, and when. And so there was a consultation process on that. Some notes were released on that at the beginning of June, and then it's going to be a process of the next several months until we see the details of the law. What does this all mean for leather? Well, in all of the regulations, it's likely that leather will be in scope. It's included specifically in the current draft of the US Forest Act, and in the European Commission and the European Council. The EU Council produced their comments, which includes leather in scope. Though in the UK, they are seeming to be heading towards starting with soy and palm oil, we believe, and leather and beef may come later. So there'll be additional time before leather was included. In all cases, there's a requirement of some sort of documentation to demonstrate that you know the sourcing provenance of what you're getting. As I said, it's not individual traceability, but it's to know where things are coming from, who they're coming from, and producing some sort of due diligence documentation to show you've done a risk assessment, that you've taken steps towards risk mitigation. In some cases, there's going to be an assessment of high and medium, potentially, and low risk areas, so that the reporting requirements for lower risk regions would be lower. And in addition to these 3 countries, we know that other countries have been following the processes, especially in the EU, and other regulations are likely to come on board, especially if once these are passed and become into law, we can expect other regulations which hopefully will be aligned so that it becomes simpler for operators, so for producer countries and processors and traders to know what's expected and not have to go through lots of different hoops in different areas of where they're exporting to. So what can companies do to prepare for these proposed regulations? There's an initiative called the Accountability Framework that was set up by a number of NGOs to provide guidance on all aspects of adopting and implementing a plan for sustainable sourcing and sale of commodities. And it can help provide detailed guidance for the different pieces of work along the way, and especially that to help demonstrate due diligence, which all these regulations are aiming to get towards. And so public commitment, what should be in there, for example, and then how to conduct an assessment of exposure to risk. Engaging with suppliers is obviously very important so that they understand what you would need to comply with these regulations. And we also hope that the regulations can help raise a standard of business as usual and lead to a line asked for companies. So the goal is that actually it should make things easier, clearer, and simpler, more effective and efficient to implement, rather than just having a plethora of different asks from different companies. So of course, we recognize that could take some time to get there. And then provide different aspects of support for producers or buyers in country to help them be able to source in ways that are demonstrably deforestation free and can reach whatever requirements there are in importing countries, such as in regards to supporting data availability for traceability. And NGOs such as ours and others are here to help. We really want to support the implementation of these commitments. We do not want companies to be scared away from high-risk areas. We really want to have these regulations be an opportunity to work with producer countries and with processors and farmers to really support their efforts to be able to comply, improve forest governance in forest countries, and then allow them to be able to document what's necessary so that importing countries can continue to source products from these areas, but just in the knowledge that they are going to be reducing deforestation risk and supporting efforts both to protect forest biodiversity and reduce emissions from deforestation, so supporting climate change. Please get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you very much for your time.
And I had forgotten to unmute myself. Yeah, so thank you to Natalie as well for that presentation on the legislation. I think more to come for sure. But it's interesting to see how things are evolving. Thank you, a big thank you to all our speakers today. I know a lot of content was shared with the audience today, and as we mentioned, the recording is going to be made available. So if you want to dig back into the content later on, please, you'll have the opportunity to do that. But just before we conclude, I just wanted to list a couple of key points from this webinar, and actually listening to our speakers speak throughout, there could be a bunch more of key points here, but we'll go through these ones to start off with. As Isabella demonstrated very clearly, there's no way to deny that deforestation remains a critical issue. Cattle production is a significant driver of deforestation. If there is a country, I guess, we want to focus on, particularly that would look like Brazil, given that over 40% of global tropical primary forest loss occurred in Brazil in 2021. It's not all doom and gloom. There is hope. There is an increase in the collaborations and financings to address deforestation. Companies are setting commitments. They may need a bit of help to, improve the commitments that are being made, but it is happening. Deforestation legislation is coming. And it will hopefully drive alignment in expectations and also provide the support that is needed to implement them and have the impact that is needed. At Textile Exchange, we really see that there is a great opportunity for brands using bovine leather to take action and really leverage their market power to drive change when it comes to this topic. We think there is a need to send an aligned message to stop deforestation at the farming levels of the bovine leather supply chain, and starting off by setting up robust commitments and setting common expectations to the supply chain is probably the first best step to take. And finally, but not least, it is absolutely critical that the farmers that are preserving their forests are recognized and supported for their efforts. As Hilary mentioned, there is a real economic benefit in cutting down trees. And so farmers that are that are keeping those trees standing and delivering the ecosystem services that are needed need to be rewarded for that. And just to finish, it's a pleasure for me to also announce that Textile Exchange is working in a joint effort with a few other organizations on building a call to action for brands to reach 100% deforestation-free leather sourcing. And so I'm just gonna, in the couple of minutes that we have left, I'm just gonna let Anne Gillespie, Textile Exchange's Impact Acceleration Director, speak to this roadmap. And I'll let you unmute.
Thank you, Nicole. And I have to say another thanks to the incredible generosity and expertise of the speakers. It's been, it's just reignites my passion for the work that we're doing. And yeah, I think, coming through all of this, we've had a 360-degree view of all the reasons why we need to tackle deforestation in the leather supply chain. And I think it's pointing to this opportunity that we have to really work together as the NGOs in the background, but even more importantly, as the leather industry to drive this action. One reminder, Textile Exchange, there's been a lot of talk about legal and no legal deforestation, and people talk about no net or net deforestation. Our stance is very much on no deforestation at all, which means you can't plant one area and then replant it at a later date. So based on that, I wanted to walk you through what we've developed as a roadmap to get to that holy grail of deforestation-free leather by 2030, or hopefully even sooner. So if you can just click through one at a time, Nicole. So as Natalie was saying, the first thing to do is to set that policy or that public commitment on being deforestation and conversion free with your leather. We asterisk that because we also have, with our Leather Impact Accelerator, a whole section for animal welfare. And our experience, both from the producer end and the brand end, is that the focus is on coupling up the two of them. But focusing on the DCF for now. The next step, once you've made that commitment, is to evaluate your supply chains. And that really means, do you know where the slaughterhouses are located? Because that's going to tell you where the farming is happening, and that will be how you evaluate the risk level of your supply chain. So click. The first scenario is that you don't know where they are. And to be honest, that's quite common in most brands. So don't panic if that's who you are. But then you start the process of starting to map your supply chains to identify where are those slaughterhouses. And again, through the Leather Impact Accelerator, we provide some guidance and support to do that. And there's other sources for that as well. But then we really urge you to use the impact incentives to build supply. And our focus with the impact incentives right now really is in Brazil, because it's the highest need. And it's the highest opportunity to really stop deforestation and preserve all that carbon stock and biodiversity, et cetera. So the impact incentives, just very quickly, it's essentially a book and claim system with some important modifications that we've discussed on other webinars. So next one is, if you do know where your slaughterhouses are and they're in a high-risk area, then definitely use the impact incentives model to build the supply in the regions that are surrounding them. That could be, you know, a radius of a couple 100 kilometers. It could be the whole state, or it could be the country. And then finally, you may know where your slaughterhouses are and they are in a low risk area. And in that case, we're saying monitor where your supply chains are, but we still encourage you to use the impact incentives to build supply. And a great example of that is H&M, one of the first companies to buy impact incentives with our current pilot. And they have a policy of not sourcing from Brazil, yet they purchased the incentives from Brazil in order to drive that positive change where it's needed most. So at the end of phase one, which is really about building the supply of not only deforestation free, but also traceable cattle farms, we'll have a good bulk of farms that can help deliver on that. And brands will know where their slaughterhouses are, which sets them up to send those communications to the meat packer or the slaughterhouse level to be deforestation free. Now, one of the challenges currently is there's no kind of credible global third-party protocol that brands can reference to say, we want you to be deforestation free, and this is what we expect you to do to deliver on that. So that's work that's also happening right now, or it's getting started with WWF and NWF and all the different players. So because that's still not available, it gives us a perfect window to be focusing on building supply. And by the time we've done that, that protocol should be ready, and then brands are able to act directly with their slaughterhouses. And then after that, it's just implement, monitor, report, and then we get there. And you should be able to source your deforestation-free leather. So that's it. Thank you, Nicole. And I think we still have a few moments for questions.
Yes, we do. Thanks, Anne. Yes. So let me just check in the Q&A here. There's one question. Actually, it seems like there are two questions that have been answered already. One around the ground data, or the data driven analysis and insights. Isabella, I don't know if you want to just touch on that quickly for everyone. There's actually two questions that were directed at you. I don't know if you want to maybe just share it with the entire audience.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you for the questions. These came from Diana. She was asking if people around the world, particularly on the ground, have access to the data for WRI, and that is correct. So since our tool is free, openly accessible, we have people all around the world who are using our map, dashboard, as well as Global Forest Review. So all that data is accessible, and many of the forest defenders that I mentioned earlier that are using this data include civil society, NGOs. So we have people from the local level to the government level to private sector using this data. And then she also had a question around shifting agriculture. And I explained how this includes agricultural practices where forests are cleared This is used for agricultural production for a few years and temporarily abandoned to allow trees to regrow. So thanks again for those questions. If you have any other questions, I'll include my email in the chat, and also feel free to go on the Global Forest Watch website. I'll also put that in the chat as well.
Thank you, Isabella. And we'll be anyhow sharing the presentation, so you'll have access to all the email addresses that were shared throughout the webinar. Someone has asked for the link for the New York Times event, and we'll make sure that is shared with you. We have one question around the implementation of the UK Environmental Act that Natalie touched based on. Natalie is not with us right now, so I'll make sure that question is communicated to her and that you get that answer as soon as possible. So if there are no more questions, I would just like to thank everyone for participating today. I know this was not necessarily the best timing for everyone, but hopefully those of you that could attend got a lot out of it. We will have our part 3 of our webinar series in September, so please be on the lookout for communications on the event. And if you have any questions, it seems to be that all the speakers today are very open for you to just reach out to them directly. So please do so, and reach out to us at Textile Exchange if you need anything. And I think we will end the webinar here. Thank you. And I'll let Rose take over.
Thank you to our speakers, and thank you for participating in today's webinar. Again, as a friendly reminder, an email will be sent to all participants with a link to today's presentation. That concludes our webinar. Thank you. Goodbye.